Hi all, I'm sorry we can't meet in person, but this is David Gallagher. I'm going to be teaching a class today, Filling the Gaps, number 7, on the reliability of Scripture. So today we're going to talk about the topic of the reliability of Scripture, and we're talking here about the historical reliability, as meaning whether or not Scripture is describing things that actually happened, or whether, on the other hand, it's just like some sort of myth, made up, pious sort of myth that's not really true. Okay, so as you know, we believe certain things by faith, and we take them to be true, but the question is our faith blind, so to speak? We just take it to be true because somebody told us. We don't really think about it. There's no real evidence for it. In fact, it's kind of irrational to accept it as true. Or do we think that it's reasonable to believe what we believe? Okay, in other words, is there evidence, are there real facts, things that we can know by non-faith modes, right, which make it rational to believe what we believe? It doesn't do away with the fact that we believing meaning we take to be true what somebody tells us. Okay? But the question is whether or not it's a reasonable thing to believe what we believe. And so there's a whole field of study that deals with this question called apologetics, which tries to look at this question: is it reasonable to believe what we believe on faith? Right? So today's class is a little piece of apologetics, and the particular thing we're going to look at is whether or not Scripture is reliable historically. Okay? And this is important because Christianity is a historical religion, so Christianity makes a historical claim. When we say the creed, we say that Jesus Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate. When we say that, we're talking about a real historical figure, Pontius Pilate, who lived in a real place and lived at a very definite time, right? So when we say that Jesus Christ suffered, died, and rose from the dead, at this time, at this place, that's a historical claim. It either happened or it didn't happen, all right? So Christianity is not just some teaching of timeless wisdom. Some of the world religions are like that. Okay, but actually, Christianity makes a very real historical claim about a real historical figure, Jesus Christ. All right? So if you think of the following figures, okay, think of Donald Duck. Everybody knows Donald Duck? Okay, Paul Bunyan. You know Paul Bunyan? You may not put Paul Bunyan. He's the guy with the big axe, the woodsman from up, in Minnesota or someplace, right? Chops down trees. And Johnny Appleseed. You've heard of Johnny Appleseed? Okay, so the question would be, are these real figures or not? What do you think about Donald Duck? Obviously not. All right. Paul Bunyan. Actually, no. Paul Bunyan's just a made-up story that they tell kids. And these big guys who are actors dress up like Paul Bunyan and go to the first grade classroom and tell stories to the kids. But that's kind of like Santa Claus at the mall. Okay, there's no such thing as Paul. Now, Johnny Appleseed, on the other hand, actually is a real historical figure. His name was John Chapman, born in 1774. He died on March 8th, 1845. You can go visit his grave. We have obituary accounts in the newspapers at the time saying that he died. And as a matter of fact, Johnny Appleseed's famous for going across the country planting apple trees. We all learned that in school. At least we did. Okay. So the fact of the matter is that's what he did do. He didn't actually plant the apple trees. He had these nurseries, and then people who wanted apple trees would go get the little trees and plant them in their farms and their homes. So actually there's a lot of Johnny Appleseed he did exist, and he did do pretty much what the stories about him say he did. So the question is, with Jesus Christ, you say the same thing. All right, was he like Paul Bunyan, just this figure that somebody made up for whatever reason? Or is he more like Johnny Appleseed? Actually existed, actually did real things, and there's evidence. You can go, visit the grave of, if you were a historian asking about Johnny Appleseed, you'd say, well, looks like he did what he did. He's in contemporary accounts, he's mentioned. Here's his grave. Here's a newspaper account talking about him. Okay, there's reason to think that this is really true, not just some myth. All right. So that's the question about the scriptures, especially the New Testament. Are they historical accounts of something that really happened, or are they just some made-up writings that people who wanted to believe something made up for their followers or whatever? Okay, that's the question. All right, so the first thing we need to do to talk about this question is to ask, what's the nature of historical truth and historical evidence? Okay, history is not the same as physics. When you want to do physics, you get in your lab or you do your measurements, you do your experiments, and you actually talk about things that exist right now that you can do experiments on, and then other people can do the experiments and see whether your experiment really worked or not, and all that kind of stuff. Well, history's obviously not like that. Why is that? Because history, by definition, does not exist right now. It's the past. You can't get to the past directly. It's just the nature. So when you do historical investigation and want to know what's happened in the past, you have to depend on people's testimony, other sources. Okay, you don't, unless you can do time travel. You can do that in the movies, but in real life, as far as I know, nobody does that. So if you want to know about what happened in the past, okay, you have to rely on testimony. Okay, so let's just say a little bit about that, because it's important to look. If you're going to look at the New Testament, the Gospels, and even the letters of St. Paul and the Acts of the Apostle as historical documents, you have to say, well, what are you looking for in a historical document? All right. Well, so if you're going to try to find out what happened in the past and you weren't there yourself, what do you have to do? You have to rely on some other person. Okay. And here you can really have two big categories. You can rely on a person who's alive that you can talk to, or you can rely on some account, normally written, especially in the old days before they had videos and stuff like that. You have a written account that somebody wrote down, okay, about the past. All right. All right. So what's the best thing of all? If you were bringing a historian, probably the best thing would be to talk to a living person who was actually an eyewitness of the events. Okay, I say, yeah, I was there. I'll tell you what happened and what didn't happen. Okay, so if you're a historian, you look for eyewitnesses, someone who was there. If you wanted to write a history of D-Day, now it's getting hard, but 30 years ago, you could have found a lot of people who were alive, and you could have gone and talked to them and found out at least their experiences of it. Okay. Now, the second thing, if you couldn't find any eyewitnesses, would be to find somebody who talked to an eyewitness. Okay, someone who knew an eyewitness. Say, yeah, my father was on D-Day, and he used to tell the following stories. Okay, that's one remove. All right. Okay. Now, if there's no eyewitnesses and nobody that talked to eyewitnesses, which after enough time passes by, there won't be, okay, then what you have to rely on generally are written accounts. Okay, somebody wrote something down. And here again, you have the same kind of division. So you'd want a written account by an eyewitness, or you'd want a written account by somebody who talked to an eyewitness. All right. Or you might want something that's written from a long tradition. Okay, sometimes there's things that just kind of like been handed down for centuries or hundreds of years, but everybody just kind of knows that that's what happened. Okay, and that's got a certain force if everybody agrees on that. Mm-hmm. So when we get to the written records, then what we want to know is the writer who's writing this thing somebody who would know the facts? Okay, so is he himself an eyewitness? Did he talk to eyewitnesses? Another important fact is, how soon after the events was this account written? Why is that? Well, especially the question is, were there eyewitnesses still alive when he wrote it? So he may not be an eyewitness, but when you write something down and eyewitnesses are around, it's not that easy to make stuff up. Okay? Or if there's still people around that talk to eyewitnesses, it's not that easy to make stuff up, because people are there to say, hey, that's just crazy. Okay? I was alive when President Reagan was shot. In fact, I was probably about a half a mile away from where he was shot when he was shot in Washington, D.C. Okay? So if someone came to me and said, oh yeah, he was shot, 3 blocks from the Capitol, I'd say, no, he wasn't shot 3 blocks from the Capitol. I was there. I didn't witness the shooting, but everybody knew. It was clear where this thing happened, and it wasn't down by the Capitol. Okay, it was up on Connecticut Avenue. All right. So it makes a big difference. The closer you are to the events, especially if there's eyewitnesses still alive, whether or not this is going to be a trustworthy account. All right. Then there's the question, is the writer careful about his facts? Is this somebody who's doing good research? Are his judgments, you could say, sober, or are they kind of crazy? Does he make mistakes? All right. How would you know that? Well, because one of the things you want to look at with any particular historical source is how does it fit in with the other historical sources? There's a kind of corroboration that happens if what you say is corroborated by other things. All right. So you look at other written sources, especially if there's other contemporary written sources, and if everybody kind of agrees on a point, you'll say, oh, well, that's probably true. I mean, everybody agrees on it. Or if 5 people say, it happened on this street, and one person said it happened on the other street, you say, well, he's probably wrong. All right. Then besides other written sources, there's another very important thing that's called archaeology, which are just other objects besides writing, which tell you certain things about what happened. Simple example case here is, when did certain rulers rule? Well, you can actually use coins, because usually when they were ruling, then the coins would have their head on it. Okay. So and if you can date that coin, then you can say something about the dating of the person. Just that's just a little. But here's another very interesting little historical. Did they actually crucify people by nailing to the cross? Okay. That was doubted at one point, but then they found actually somewhere, I think in Judea, the actual skeleton of a guy who had been crucified, and they have the nail still in the bones of the foot. So yeah, that's corroboration that was not made up, wasn't just some story. I mean, they actually did do it that way. So that's where you get, that's archaeology, and there's a lot of things like that. So now, turning now to the New Testament, we're talking about Matthew, Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts of the Apostles, letters of St. Paul, and so on. We have to ask the following questions. Were the authors of the New Testament eyewitnesses of what they record? Okay. And if they weren't eyewitnesses, did they talk to eyewitnesses? Also, when were they written? How big's the gap between when they were written and when the eyewitnesses lived? Were they written while eyewitnesses lived, or were they written later? So the date becomes an important question. Obviously, the closer they are to the events, the better they are as historical documents. Second big question is a corroboration. Are the things that are recorded in the Gospels corroborated by other historical texts, especially from non-Christian authors? All right? And are the things recorded in those scriptures corroborated by archaeology? I mean, are they just kind of like facts on the ground that are exactly prove that what was said there is actually historical, or makes it clear, or indicates that it would be the case? All right? So, and the last question, which we won't have much time to talk about today, would be the integrity of the texts. These texts were passed down, copied over centuries, and are they integral? Are they still the same way they were when they were written, or did changes get introduced as they were copied over the centuries? We can talk about that quickly. Okay. So the first question here is, were the writers of the New Testament eyewitnesses? Okay. Well, if you look at the testimony of the scriptures themselves, they in fact do present themselves as the work of eyewitnesses. All right. So let me just read here quickly from the Gospel of John, okay, the Apostle John, and he says, this is at the end of his Gospel, he says, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true." All right. So he's claiming that he was there himself, and he talks about the disciple. We know that in the Gospel of John, he never refers to John. He always talks about the disciple whom Jesus loved and things like that. Okay, he also never calls John the Baptist John the Baptist. He refers to John the Baptist as John, as if like, you know who I am. Whereas everybody else calls him John the Baptist because they got to distinguish him from John the Apostle. So just one of these little interesting differences in the Gospels. Okay. Or let's take Luke. Now Luke's interesting. Luke makes it clear that he's not an eyewitness. Okay. Nevertheless, he also makes it clear that he did a lot of work to talk to the eyewitnesses. All right? So I think the introduction to his gospel is interesting because he's a very self-conscious historian. And he says the following: "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed. So he makes it clear. He goes out of his way to make it clear that I talked to the eyewitnesses. Okay? And, having followed all things closely for some time past, in other words, he did some work. He went and talked to people and actually did what a historian does. You talk to the witnesses, and then he puts together an orderly account. So the claim in the gospel themselves that this is the work of eyewitnesses or the work of somebody who's talked to eyewitnesses. Right? Let me just read one more little passage here because I think it's from St. Paul. So Paul also never claimed to have been a direct witness. He did claim to have seen Jesus Christ in vision. Okay. Right. Nevertheless, when he's talking about the resurrection, so that's one of the most supernatural events in the Gospels. There's full of miracles, but that's kind of like the biggest miracle, you could say. Talking to the Corinthians, so his first letter to the Corinthians, talking about the resurrection, he says the following, okay, he says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." In other words, I was told this, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. So this thing that he appeared to 500 brethren after the resurrection, and most of them are still alive, implying that, if you don't believe me, you can go talk to them. In other words, I'm not just making this up. We have a lot of real eyewitnesses who were there at the event, and they're still alive. Okay? Paul wrote his letters really between the years about 50 and 65. So you have to think about that. If Jesus Christ died, let's say the year 33, then that's about 20 years after he died. Well, 20 years after an event, a lot of people are still around. I mean, you couldn't just make stuff up about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ 20 years after it happened. If you did make it up, people would say that's crazy. That never happened. Okay, and I think that's important to realize, and the Gospels include all these miracles, okay, and they're written within the lifetime, then, and they weren't just dismissed, somehow they were seen as credible. Okay. All right. So that's the first question. Was the New Testament written by eyewitnesses or people who knew the eyewitnesses? And the answer is yes. Oh, that's the claim. You could say they just made all that up. Okay, but then the next question is, do we find corroborating evidence in other, especially non-Christian writings? All right. And as a matter of fact, we do. So again, we don't have a lot of time today, but let me just talk about maybe two of these sources. So there's one of the earliest references to Jesus Christ. He's from a Roman historian named Tacitus, okay, who died in around the year 120 AD. That's when he died. Okay, so he's, writing maybe 70 years after Jesus Christ died. All right. So he talks about events that occurred in Rome in the year 64. All right. And so what happened was, this was the Emperor Nero. You probably heard of Nero, a little bit crazy. And Nero, there was a big fire in Rome. Okay, for 9 days this fire burned. And the suspicion was that Nero set the fire because Nero wanted to build this big palace with a big garden with lakes and things in it, and he wanted to get rid of all the buildings that were there, so he started this fire. So when the rumor was spread around that Nero himself had started the fire, Nero, according to the historian here, in order to put the blame somewhere else, blamed it on the Christians. Now this is the year 64. We're talking 30 years after the death of Jesus Christ. Okay. And so let me read so consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abomination, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Now this is interesting. This is a totally non-Christian author writing the history of Rome, and he writes that Nero, in order to shift the blame, whether or not he did or not, but he pointed to the Christians. So what does that mean? One, it means that the Christians were already known enough that he could blame them. Okay? It's interesting that Tacitus says he was put to death, all right, under Pontius Pilate. Okay, there's exact corroboration under Tiberius. Actually, if you read the Gospel of Luke, he's very careful to say who is the emperor and all these kinds of things. He situates it. All right, so here you have pretty clear corroboration from a totally non-Christian author that Jesus Christ existed, that he died under Pontius Pilate by the extreme penalty, which is crucifixion. That was only for slaves. The Roman citizen wouldn't be crucified. All right. So let's just turn and look a little bit at the archaeology. Okay, how does the New Testament do that way? Here it might be interesting to contrast it with some of the Mormon claims. I'm just thinking of another religion. So the Mormons have a whole history of this city somewhere down in Central America, where these people came and lived, and the fact of the matter is nobody's ever found it. Okay? It's just they look for it, they try to find it, but nobody can find it. The Christian religion is not at all like that. Okay, it's all based on places that are, Jerusalem. Well, we know where Jerusalem is. It's still there today. Rome. We know where Rome is. We know where Bethlehem is. We know where the Mediterranean is. We know where Crete is. We know where Malta is. Egypt's still there. I mean, if you start looking at the places, for example, of the New Testament, these are all real places, easily located. Okay, I mean, these are and the Romans and Pontius Pilate and the officials and things like that. Okay, so the story is presented as a real historical story, and there are real places. The Mount of Olives, Mount Tabor, Kedron Valley, these things are all there. We know where they are. There's no, okay. But there's a lot of things in the Gospels which are actually things that over the centuries people couldn't find. They thought they were making them up. Classic case here are the pool with 5 porticos mentioned in St. John's Gospel. There's a man laying at the pool, and it says 5 porticos. Porticos are like gates, all right? And for years, the scholars said, oh, that's just symbolic. He just made that up. Typical sort of just made up thing because they wanted that symbolism of 5. Until some years ago, digging around in Jerusalem excavations, what did they find? They found a pool. And what did they find? The pool actually has 5 gates, one on each side, and there's one in the middle, kind of dividing 2 parts of the pool. So actually, St. John's Gospel is exactly accurate on that point. And this has happened many times, that the level of detail is pretty, it'd be hard to think that anybody could have gotten that detail and gotten it right without being an eyewitness. Okay, it's not writing like a novelist. Okay. Now, the best case here, we'll go quickly, is just St. Luke. So as I said, St. Luke's a very careful historian. And if you read the Gospel, the very first part of the Gospel of Luke is this very self-conscious situating of the events in a time and in a place. Who was the emperor in Rome? Who was the local Roman authority? At the time of the census, stuff that, in other words, we're going to locate this supernatural action, right, in a very concrete historical setting, and he's very careful about that. Where you really see it is in the Acts of the Apostles. So remember, in the Acts of the Apostles, Paul's going all over the place. He's got these apostolic journeys, and in the Acts of the Apostles, St. Luke mentions 32 different countries, 54 different cities, these by name, 9 islands, and in none of those does he make a mistake. Okay? They're all accurate. They're all in the right place. They all have the right name. Okay? He makes no mistakes referring to official titles. Okay? A number of cases, scholars thought he was wrong until they found out from certain pieces of evidence that, in fact, he wasn't wrong. That was the name of the title. He has this very detailed description of the shipwreck. I don't know if you read the Acts, one of the best parts of the Acts, they're on the ship and they get in this big storm and they have to, throw away all the rigging, throw all the cargo out, tie these ropes around the hull to keep it together. Okay. And actually, historians of maritime historians treat that as a source. It's one of the things they use to learn about how people did things on ships in that time. I mean, that's how accurate, that's how detailed the description is. Okay, and that's a first person description too. When you get to the Acts, Luke writes in the first person. There's two different places where, and he's very conscious about it. If he wasn't there, he doesn't say we. And then chapter 16, at one point, all of a sudden becomes we. You say, okay, he's letting you know that now I was there at that point. Okay. So Luke is, in terms of the archaeology, holds up very well. All right. I could say more about that, but we don't have time. All right, so that's I would say the archaeology. Now the next question then would be the integrity of the texts. Okay, and I say this because people will sometimes claim that the Bible we now have is not the Bible that was actually written because people changed it over time. Okay. Why is that an issue? Because until the year 1450, when the printing press was invented by Mr. Gutenberg, all right, everything that was written was handwritten. Okay, it was written manually, and so you have what you call manuscripts. Okay, so all these old writings are manuscripts. All right, and manuscripts didn't always last that long, like books don't last that long, and so they had to be copied. So then the question is, when you come to manuscripts, all right, this thing's been copied I don't know how many times from the original. How accurate is it? All right. All right. So the question then is, when you're talking about this, the integrity of the text. So now let's say a little bit about the integrity of the gospel texts themselves. So we're talking here about manuscripts, okay, handwritten documents written on papyrus originally, and then vellum, which comes from sheep, which holds up a lot longer. But in any ancient text, okay, you have the following problem. You have the original, that was whoever wrote it, the author, okay, and then copies were made. These copies were made by copyists, people sitting there copying line by line. So then the question is, well, copyists, like everybody else in the world, make mistakes. If they put a mistake in the text, the next copyist comes along and he copies that mistake, and then he makes his own mistakes, and then you do this kind of like telephone tag. The document could keep getting worse and worse. So then the question is, well, how reliable is the document? Okay, so the question is, so if we take today's New Testament, especially we're talking now about the Greek text because that's originally what it was written in. That's what we have. How accurate is today's Greek text as opposed to that written in the first century? All right. Now this is a problem not just for the gospel. This is a problem for any ancient text. Right. Well, on this score, as a matter of fact, the gospels hold up very well. Okay. So what do you want to look for in these things? First of all, given the manuscripts you have, how old are they? And obviously the older they are, the better, because they're closer to the original. Right? So one of the questions you look at, you say, what's the gap between when the original is written and the oldest manuscripts we have? Okay? So if you take something like Plato, if we take when he wrote it and the oldest manuscripts we have, the gap's about 750 years. All right? If you look at a guy like Thucydides, Greek historian, the gap's about 1,300 years. All right? And that's just, in other words, when you start getting into most of these Greek and Latin, Greek manuscripts that you study, that's the gap. It's centuries of a gap. Okay. Next question would be, how many manuscripts do you have? Okay. If you just have one manuscript, you don't know whether there's mistakes in there or not because you have nothing to compare it with. If you have two, now you can have, if there's differences, which they tend to be, then you at least know something's not right because they're not the same. If you have 50, then it's a lot easier to decide, okay, 49 say this word and 50 has a different word. Well, we'll go with the 49. Okay. So there's people who look at these texts and study them and try to figure out what's the best text. These are called the critical editions and so on. All right. So the question then is, well, how do the Gospels as texts, ancient texts, hold up compared to other ancient texts? Because let's face it, what we know about ancient history at this point is all based on these texts and the archaeology. Whether it's Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, that's where we get our knowledge. All right. Well, let me just say a little bit then about the the bottom line is this, that the New Testament texts are way superior to any other historical ancient text. Okay, just give an example here. So Julius Caesar, anybody who studied Latin, especially when you get sophomore year, second year Latin, they make you read the Gallic Wars of Julius Caesar, okay, which were written, in the 1st century BC, when Caesar himself wrote them. Every year he'd come back from battle and he'd publish his works, okay, and they were pretty popular in Rome. All right. So, what's the how many manuscripts do we have? Actual manuscripts of Julius Caesar? About 10. What's the gap between when he wrote them and the oldest manuscript that we have? It's about 1,000 years. Okay. What about the New Testament, the Greek text of the New Testament? Well, how many manuscripts do we have of those? Close to 6,000. And there's no other text in the ancient world that comes anywhere near that. Okay. I mean, we're talking like not even half of that. All right. Okay. The biggest one probably is Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. That was it. All right. Okay. Then, what's the gap between the oldest text and when it was written? Okay. Actually, it's less than 100 years, okay, which is by far, but way by far, the smallest gap there is. So I just throw you a little picture here. This is a little picture of the oldest piece of the New Testament that we have. This is a little piece of papyrus they found in Egypt. It comes from John's Gospel. It's very clear what it says. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. I believe that's here. No, this is with Pilate. So, but this is a little manuscript with Greek written on it, very legible, okay, which is dated, by the way they date these things, to the year around 120, 130. So if John wrote his gospel, some people think it's around 80 or 90 AD, and this is 120 or 130, you're talking less than 50 years between when the original was written and when this is found. So if you look at any of the criteria that would be used to judge historical texts, the New Testament is not usually, always superior to almost any other text. Now that's important because if you say you can't trust the New Testament's writings because of, they got copied wrong or stuff like that, then you have to say, well, then you can't trust Julius Caesar. You have to start doubting everything we know about Alexander the Great, okay, about Nero or whoever you want. Okay? So the fact of the matter is, taking normal historical criteria that a historian would use, the New Testament documents do just fine. In fact, they do very well. So as a last point, I would just say a little bit about, let's call it modern scholarship regarding Scripture, okay? Because you will often hear things saying like modern scholars say this, modern scholars say this, and Bible scholars say this, and Bible scholars say that. And a lot of times what they will be saying is that we don't really know what's true in the Gospels and what's made up. And they spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's the real historical kernel, you could say, in there, what they call the real Jesus, the historical Jesus, and try to separate that from all this other stuff that's added on that kind of grew up, over the decades or centuries that kind of the authors put in there, but it's not really true. Okay? And the basic assumption is that a lot or most of what you find in the gospel isn't really true, but would fit in the category of myth. Somebody made this stuff up. All right. Now, you have to ask the question, well, why do they say that? Okay. And let me just say quickly that for many of them, they come to the scriptures with a certain presupposition. Okay, they are what we would call rationalists. Say a rationalist is a person who thinks we can only know what we can know through our own reason, using our own mind. Okay, that we don't know anything that God might have revealed to us. Okay, that's the first thing. Okay, so the idea that God could actually speak to us directly through a prophet like Moses or through Jesus, okay, that's just like a priori not accepted. Second, they're what we call naturalists. A naturalist is a person who thinks that only those things happen in the world which happen according to the normal laws of nature. Everything that happens that way. Well, if you actually believe that, then something like a miracle is impossible a priori, because miracles by definition, don't follow the normal course of nature. Okay, blind people don't get their sight back because someone just put a little mud on their eyes. Okay, it just doesn't happen. Okay, all right. So it's very important that the rationalism and the naturalism, are actually philosophical positions. Okay? Both of those things I described are philosophical assertions, that we can only know what our mind itself can know. Okay? That nothing in the world happens except according to the laws of nature. Those are not anything you get from studying Scripture. So I mean, if the Bible scholar comes to the Scriptures with those prejudices, I'm going to call them prejudices, well, that's a philosophical question. Okay? Now, what happens when you come to the Scriptures with that prejudice? Well, you open the books and you find all kinds of miracles. Jesus walking on the water, Jesus multiplying the loaves, Jesus curing the blind, curing the lame, etc., etc. And what do you say? Well, we know ahead of time that such things could never happen. And since they could never happen, but they're described in the Gospels, they must have been made up. And therefore, there's all kinds of stuff in the gospel that's all made up. So what you have to do is get rid of all that made up stuff and find out what's this kind of historical little kernel that's left. And they spend years and years in talking about this, okay? All right? But you have to stand back and say, well, wait a minute. This all started because, if you don't have those prejudices, if you think, in fact, God can speak to us, if you think that God being God could actually become man, that God being God could actually cure people because he created them in the first place, okay? Then you're not going to say ahead of time, oh, that just could not have happened. Okay? Right? So a lot of when you see somebody, Bible scholars tell us this and Bible scholars tell us that, the first thing you have to ask yourself, well, what does this Bible scholar himself believe? Is he a rationalist Bible scholar? If he is, well, then of course he's going to think this stuff's all false. But not because he's a scholar. That's the interesting thing. It's not because he's a scholar. It's because he has certain philosophical prejudices that he brings to his study of the text. Okay, so that's important. So if you're going to study the question at all, you have to actually pay attention very much to the prejudices, the presuppositions of the scholar who's talking. All right. Okay, so that's the basic class squeezed down to 30 minutes. Would have been a lot nicer if we'd had the extra 90 minutes, but I hope this is helpful. And my thoughts go out to all of you. I know this is a difficult time, and I hope you're getting through it well, and I hope that you and your families are well, and that hopefully by next month we can have a normal class again.